start this session, which is composed of a session of presentations and then followed by a roundtable of more interactive discussions. The topic of the session, as you see from the program, is retuning the European public-private partnership agenda. And of course, we have heard reference to the question of the PPP in the previous session as well, some comments very specific. But I think we are trying now to look at this instrument mostly in the context of financing the development of infrastructures in Europe. This is something that does not need to be sort of discussed very much, because now there seems to be a very broad consensus that this is the way out of the prolonged crisis in which the European Union and the Eurozone have been finding themselves for the last few years. But then again, if I may add one personal touch to the discussion, is that the agenda is very clear, the issues are clearly on the table. Still, we do not see enough in terms of interconnection of the infrastructures in Europe. We still have in front of us sort of different national situation, different national utilities, sometimes operating in conditions of monopoly or near monopoly. And again, I wonder whether we have a problem that can be identified mainly as a problem of financing, which of course will be important to fill the infrastructural gap in these areas, or whether we need also something more in terms of creating a sort of a comprehensive European strategy of interconnections, again, perhaps bringing together the various national actors around the table and using perhaps the competition policy instruments the European has in order to force a certain more active degree of cooperation in the field of interconnections. But as I said, this was a question I had in the back of my mind for many years, so I thought that this was the day in which maybe I get an answer for that. And so as the group of speakers this afternoon is certainly very well adapted to answer these questions and to give us a full picture of the situation. Again, linking the PPP and the agenda of the network of infrastructures in Europe. So the first speaker is Giovanni Gorno Tempini, the CEO of Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, and he will give us, I think, a broad picture of what is needed to finance infrastructures in Europe and to identify the bottlenecks that are still there that may prevent the sort of the investment of private capital into these sectors. And then Carlo Secchi from Bocconi University, a good old colleague of mine, and he has been lately coordinator for the Trans-European Network in the field of transport for the European Commission. And then we'll hear from Matteo del Fante, who's now CEO of Terna, an important player in the electricity field, and so he'll give us a view of the situation in this very delicate sector. And then Nicolás Merigo, who's the CEO of the Marguerite Fund, one of the most innovative experiments in financing greenfield infrastructure in Europe, and so we're all very eager to hear from him. So as this instrument in front of me clearly indicates, each speaker has 10 minutes, and then we can hope to have more time for perhaps some interaction among yourselves. So, Giovanni, you are the first.
Thank you, Fabrizio, and good afternoon to everyone. After so many things have been said this morning, it's difficult to add something original. I will try to give the view from Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, so from a very practical point of observation as we see things, as they say, from the field. And the key points on which I'm going to quickly elaborate in my 10 minutes are the following. If there is a time when talking about investment is really necessary, that is now. I think that many statistics have been shown this morning, but the fragile European recovery makes even more important to focus on investments. The second key point is that there is a lot of investments that could be done, a lot. And the numbers are always so big that they become almost meaningless to the large public, but thinking in European terms, the hundreds and several hundreds of billions must be the scope of the exercise that needs to be implemented. The third point is that whether people like it or not, the public sector has a key role. And the public sector is widely defined from EU level, obviously, to national and to local level. But the public sector as a whole plays a very important role in setting policies, in defining regulation, and acting as an authority. The fourth point on which I'm going to touch is that because we're talking big money, and the public sector is intrinsically short, as we all know, given the state of the art of public finance, is not about thinking how much public money should be put at work, but how much private capital can be involved on the base of smart public money. So there is a leverage effect that is key in determining the success of a large infrastructural program at a European level. And finally, the role of national promotional banks. I think that we as strange animals, a bridge between public and private, can play, are already playing effectively a very important role, but even more so, together with the EIB, that, with all the due respect, is doing a great job, but probably to face a program of this size needs to be in coordination with local players that have the experience of the Cassa, the CDC, the KfW, or the ECO. Now, having said the arguments on the first, why investments are needed, I think that I need to spend very few seconds. I think that we have heard this morning, seen graphs, why, how GDP growth is so unsatisfactory in Europe, and how the, well, shall we be optimistic and call it decline rather than drop in investment is one of the key factors that have created this situation. The numbers, as I said, are showing that there is a need that is in the region of hundreds of billions. What has been said also this morning, which I think it's important, is that banks can no longer be as important and key players as they have been in the past. Our good friend from ECO, Fernando, has mentioned that we need to move from bankable to investable project, he has also added that we need to move from a bank-centric approach to a capital market approach. That is very true. I completely agree with that. It is easier said than done, and I will get to that in a second. Why is it a problem financing what is so clearly needed? I think that other colleagues at the round table will mention, as the chairman has already done, the need for a true European vision, in particular on a number of key sectors. We at CASA, as main shareholders of Terna and SNAM, so the electricity grid and the gas network, are clearly in favor of pushing our companies to a more European strategy. That is what is needed for the companies, but also because of the arguments that we are discussing today. Incidentally, we should not forget that we are in an incredibly favorable time in terms of interest rates. And that is something that I did not hear this morning, maybe I missed it, but it is of paramount importance because sometimes when we talk about investments, we live looking at the past, and so we look at the cost of equity and the break-even levels when we were living back in the old days when interest rates were at different levels. The new plan that is being, let's say, is under shape as we speak is also a key aspect and important. We are looking at it very closely. Let me make one short comment. It has to do with the cooperation between a centralized function and a decentralized execution, where the success or not will be found. I think that my chairman, Franco Bassanini, has already mentioned that size does matter, and unfortunately it is small. But as I am adding today, if it is used in the right way, the leverage component can be a multiplier that could make it more interesting than originally thought. And this leads me to what is the government role in financing in particular. And the story for me is the following. If we look at infrastructure investments out of the traditional and no longer viable method of direct financing through public balance sheet, so if we look at PPP, the key aspect that needs to be a center point of attention is the equity piece. Because it is true that, as many say, that resources are available and that, in fact, we lack bankable/investable project. But having said that, and when we enter into the single project, there is plenty of debt and there is very little equity. So we need to focus on the equity piece if we talk about PPP, and this is where I think the best use of public money can be made, because if public money is used to strengthen the risk-bearing capacity of any project, then the financeability, if I may say, of the project itself will be greatly facilitated. Talking about resources, I was saying the key point is activating private capital, and private capital is in good chunk also in the hands of institutions like on my left, Terna, or on my right, Marguerite. Incidentally, in particular on my left, on the Terna side, I think using corporates to finance greenfield can be one of the best way to solve the issue, but I will not elaborate because I see that I'm already past. No, I'm already after the 10 minutes. So let me use 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
A couple of minutes more, don't worry.
To talk about us, i.e. national promotional banks. I think we are important players in this scenario, not because I'm the CEO of CASA, but because institutions like ours are those that are able to retain assets longer with a risk profile that is truly more in tune with a long-term objective, which is what is needed to finance this type of investments. We are not in competition with the private sector. We are almost all the time in cooperation with the private sector. We have a liability structure that is supporting our balance sheet so that we can take this long-term view, and therefore we can really act as a go-between, the project and the execution of it from a financial point of view that is very much needed in these days. Last final remark, I think that the key word looking at the overall theme of PPP and investment projects in here is effectively execution. Execution is key. We need to be good and quick at planning and then go to work and open the fields out there so that money effectively goes into the economy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Giovanni. I think you put your finger on a number of important issues, and I think these need to be certainly examined in the course of our session and the round table. I think I'd like to perhaps note a couple of points of what you said when you emphasized the fact that the public sector has to play a role in this field, and also the role of national development banks or promotional. I don't like this concept of promotional bank, but I mean I prefer to use national development banks. Working together with the European Investment Bank, and I think that's an important point. And then, of course, the issue of sort of the implementation of projects. But perhaps one question that we can raise from this point of view is whether the execution of project is also a function of the preparation of the project themselves, because sometimes we find that, certain projects are not very well conceived at the beginning, and therefore they tend to be difficult to implement. So I remember, for example, that in this very room we heard a report from the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and they advocated the setting up of an agency to sort of coordinate the preparation of the projects, at the European level, in order to make sure that the project arrive at the moment in which they have to be financed in a good state. But so this is perhaps an issue that we can keep in mind for our internal discussion. But now I give the floor to Carlo Secchi. I mean, he has been working with the European Commission, so perhaps you may tell us, what the European vision is all about in this area. Thank you. Carlo.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. As a matter of fact, I would not talk about a single European vision, but a variety of attempts and points of view which hopefully will converge towards common and satisfactory results. Let me pick up, before I start my rapid presentation, your last point, which is very important. The quality of people, in particular in the public administration, but not only, who overview all this. Some efforts are being carried out now at the European Commission level, at the European Investment Bank, but this is clearly not enough. We must learn on that experience and improve efforts in this direction to quite an extent. These were important in the past for the cohesion fund countries, the new member states and so on, but now it is quite clear that they are important for all the member states. And another remark I wanted to pick up from your conclusion is the importance of the execution phase. And in this respect, which is obvious, so I will not stress that, but what I wanted to stress is the fact that one very important feature of PPPs is the procurement dimension, because it brings, the private component brings in not only, or should bring in, not only money, but also expertise in the project preparation, completion, execution, and even beyond that in what I will define as a life cycle perspective of the project itself. So what I will try to do with you quickly is to express some views on which we are working at the European Commission, DG MOVE, that is transport and infrastructure, which is something in a sense parallel to the Juncker exercise, and in particular to the work carried out by the task force Mr. Scannapieco reported about this morning. So they don't necessarily coincide, but our starting point, obviously, is the new policy, which is based on a set of corridors, which should provide also visually the idea of a European network and not just a patchwork of projects. And these corridors, which we try to implement and bring to completion by 2030, have to do with many countries, 4 have to do with Italy. They have a coordinator. I am one of these. We are appointed by the European Commission, but we act in a sense independently. So what I will say today is my own opinion and does not, of course, involve that of any of the institutions. The new approach has at its disposal the so-called Connecting Euro Facility, CEF, 26+ billion euros for the current planning period, to be spent mainly in grants and grants which contribute to co-financing schemes in the different countries on the basis of annual calls. One is ongoing now, and it will close at the end of February, and it will be not half, but almost half of this amount. So 10 billion are there available for good projects to be implemented. But 10% of this has been diverted to financing even a bit more than 10%, the Juncker mechanism. But in any case, an important amount of money to be administered and to make a good use of. Of course, why investment in infrastructure are important. It was long debated, the IMF study, the fact that we are lagging behind, but lagging behind also in maintenance, not only in new investment. In some important, very important Europe member states, the most important member states, the worry now is that the lack of maintenance might produce very serious damage to the network. Bridges falling down or things of the like. Of course, we hope not. We need to work on the best possible allocation of scarce public resources and make sure that European resources I'm talking about are additional to national ones, because in some cases we have noticed that the moment European money is obtained, national money already provided for that project will be shifted to something else. And of course, at the end, we don't have a net addition to our capital stock. Contrary to some of the opinions I learned, I think there is a huge demand and also an important amount of projects available. What is needed to complete the corridors I showed to you between now and 2030 is 600 billion euros. But we have identified for the Council of Ministers of Transport 127 billion projects ready to be implemented and suitable for innovative financial instruments. That is not only for accepting grants, but also to mobilize additional capital. And to add, I would add another 10-20 billion for soft transport infrastructure, like the management systems of railroads, airplanes, and so on, and so on, and so on. So projects are there. Of course, the problem is how to trigger a better match between supply and demand. Of course, we need a very good and efficient project pipeline. The issue of technical assistance already touched upon. We must work on the regulatory framework because on the one hand, like Penelopes, we build our product and then the state aid regulations or something similar destroys everything. So there must be much more consistency within our regulatory system, state aid regulations, which must give a priori clearance, not come in when things are already ongoing. Rules which, at the end of the day, affect the Growth and Stability Pact. In particular, not only what was already discussed this morning, the Golden Rule, or variations on that theme, but the problem of state guarantees, because that can prove as a very important instrument to attract private capital. But if the state guarantee then is counted into the outstanding debt, of course you are back to square one. So we must work also on this kind of regulations, and we must focus more on rentability, on making our projects attractive. Our projects in infrastructure normally produce positive external economies, but there is no compensation for this. This was quite obvious when the state was paying for that, but if it is a private investor producing positive external economies, some compensation can be thought of. Let me give you the example of the emission trading schemes. It benefits air transport, it benefits certain types of road merchandise transport. It does not produce any benefit for railways. On the contrary, railways pay all kinds of energy taxes which are there. So we must work on that, better earmark what is produced by our projects in terms of return, elaborate on cross-financing, and so on. Otherwise, it will be, obviously, you agree with me, quite difficult to attract private capital. So, to try to sum up, regulatory issues are there. These affect complex procurement and permitting procedure. For example, a very important project between Denmark and Germany, money is there, everything is there, but the environmental clearance is not there because of two different approaches in the two countries. Clarify the state aid rules. Statistical treatment means how we cope with the Growth and Stability Pact and the Eurostat rules. Solvency II and Basel III were dealt with quite widely this morning, so they are there. And in general, have an environment which is attractive for private investors and not only discouraging. And I mentioned also the life cycle approach, that is the importance, even more so when private capital are involved, to think not of a project as a turnkey project, you finish it, then you give the keys and that's the end, but have a view of a project throughout its whole lifetime. What are the implications to keep it up to shape for maintenance, rehabilitation, and so on and so on. And then at the end of the day, have a financial package consistent with all this. And to conclude, well, before concluding, I simply provide you the example of the project bonds, but I don't want to elaborate on it because Mr. Scannapieco did it this morning. But I have two things left to say, if you allow me, Mr. Chairman. First of all, why am I quoting the project bonds, the European project bonds? Unfortunately, in Italy, we have the same term for something different, so that creates a little bit of confusion. But in any case, the project bond idea came out of the work done not by ECOFIN, but by DG Move, that is the work preparatory to the new phase of the European infrastructure layout. Because the worry was already, where are we going to find the money necessary? How are we going to attract private capital? And of course, the mechanism, which then is also at the basis of the Juncker plan, is that of making a project more attractive through capital enhancement or financial enhancement provided by public bodies. And we go back, if in public bodies we include the national governments, we go back to square one, that is state guarantees and the Eurostat rules which work against them. Final remark, what is our work plan, which is in a sense parallel to that of the Juncker task force. Their projects are projects of a very varied nature. In our case, we are working on transport projects, but the two are complementary, obviously. We want to understand better how it is possible, similarly to what was done 3 or 4 years ago with the original idea of project bonds, to have a dialogue with all those like you who are interested in investing and try to understand better what is wrong between demand and supply. There is a lot of money wanting for looking for an interesting investment, a lot of projects, and you are unable to match them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo. I think that was very interesting because we needed to have some feeling of what are the thinking in Europe and in the European Commission about what are the issues to be confronted with. And I'm very pleased to hear that you also believe that we need a stable regulatory framework, because if you want to attract investors for a long-term project, you have to give them assurance that the regulatory framework is not going to change radically over time or is not going to become more complicated and more difficult to manage. Another point that I think you made, which is important, is that, it's true that public money, this is a point that also Giovanni made, public money is needed to attract private investors, to reduce the risk and so forth. But then we also have examples of huge infrastructural projects that have been underutilized, where sort of, the compensation for the externalities allegedly produced turned to be so high that people didn't pay the toll for the highways, or high-speed trains that carry 20 passengers per train, So this is, again, an issue to the extent that, public money is put up front, then perhaps there should be a different type of scheme of compensation that is devised not in purely economic terms, but takes into account also what the actual use of certain infrastructure is going to be. But again, this is probably an issue that we can raise or in a second round of interventions. Now I give the floor to Matteo Del Fante, talking about the energy infrastructures in Europe, probably beginning with the electricity area where he's in charge of a main player. Matteo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I will do a 10 minutes focus on the electricity infrastructure, starting from the Italian experience briefly, and then moving on to the future and to Europe. You have three graphs of what was the Italian market shape in 2005, basically when Terna was born. Halfway, which is when we had probably the highest number of congestions because electricity demand was still high and connections in between market zones in Italy were not yet deployed. And then the last 11 months picture. In blue on the right, you see that currently we have only the region of Sicily, which is not connected to the continent. When a region is not connected to the rest of the market, it means that that region has a higher price of energy, and the weighted average price of the system is higher. So the value of connecting that region decreases the price of energy in the whole system. Terna from 2004, 10 years ago, has invested more than 8 billion with a very stable regulatory framework, supported mainly by the market, and technically Terna has a public concession but owns the asset, so the grid, which is a private asset. So it's private money that go to finance a public mission concessionaire role. And we believe that we're targeting for next year to color in blue the Sicilian region and have Italy as if it was a one grid shape. And this, I think, is important when we go to Europe because the concept is we have to try to do slowly in Europe what we have done in Italy in the last 10 years. And in order to do that, we believe that we need to work on building and adding additional connections to Italy. We currently have 24 4 connections which are already active. Of the 24, we have 21 which are owned by Terna, and 3 are owned by private, but they're still managed by Terna. There are 5 connections under construction, 5 more which we're working on, and they're all based at the moment on private money. And by law, Terna is building these connections with equity coming from private investors, with debt coming from hopefully financial institutions, including long-term financial institutions such as clearly CDP, and we aim to add 2 studies for 2 new connections with Greece and Tunisia for next years, which would become 2 important connections towards markets that have a very asymmetrical energy market versus Italy. Why do we need to carry on building connections? Because in the past, most of the connections we built were aimed at importing energy. Italy was short of energy, and the price, as you see in the page, was and is still higher. If you take Germany, which is usually considered the reference market, we are still almost 20 euro per megawatt above Germany, so we're still importing energy, but for the first time we're now in overcapacity in terms of capacity of production, which means that we are in the position of using the connections to export energy. And when Italy exports energy, we do 2 very good things for the system. We keep the production plants open, which means the private owners can make the plants working, and is clearly a value also in terms of employment. And we have our connections paid by the importer. So the connections, for example, of Greece, which was done over 10 years ago, that has always worked up to, let's say, a couple of years ago, has an import connection, is now working 80% of the hours of the year in terms of export. So that tells you that having a grid starting from Italy that connects Italy as much as possible with the cross-border countries is extremely important. It's extremely important because if we want to achieve a security of supply and we want to integrate the large-scale renewable projects that we have in Europe, we need to have a grid. Without a grid that connects the single countries, we will not be able to talk about a single electricity market in Europe. We are looking very carefully in this respect at the Juncker plan and the list of projects and the strategy of the plan, and we think that specifically the plan should focus on what we call the hardware of the grid. If you want to simplify, we think that the European grid will be real in, let's say, 10, 20 years, provided that 2 things happen. That all the TSOs are putting on the ground physical connections to exchange energy, and that's what we call the hardware, and that's where as I've shown you, we will be working on as much as we can. And two, if there is what we call the software, i.e. the agreement in between countries on how to exchange energy cross-border, how to use deconnections, and how to guarantee each other what in the energy market are called services, which is safety, energy that you might need, or stabilization energy that the system needs and that can have either produced in the own country or maybe given across the border. And jumping to the end and the important message I would like to leave also to the European side of the panel and the conversation and the presentation today is that we believe that Europe needs to prioritize the projects. What are defined currently as a project of common interest, we think are a bit too many. We are proposing to focus on cross-border interconnections and on those cross-border interconnections that don't find market support in terms of financing on a standalone basis. So there are some connections. I give you an example. A connection with France, we believe that the market in between equity, debt, can more or less do on its own. A connections with the Balkans, with Montenegro, given there is less production in Montenegro that cannot give stable enough projections of the cash flows for the lending institution, needs some guarantee support. So the previous presentation of Professor Secchi was highlighting the guarantee portion of the European support, which we believe is extremely important. And obviously, everything in a clear, stable, and more harmonized regulatory framework that allows us to invest and have our investors, which are giving money to Terna to do the investments, either equity or debt, with a high degree of comfort, which is already the case, but we need to push this even more strongly forward for the new interconnections. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Matteo. This was very useful presentation. I think it shows that we're still quite some time away from the target of having a fully integrated network in the field of electricity. And I'm also, as we noted with Giovanni here, the differences in the prices of this interconnection. I mean, when we export to Greece, I mean, the Greece pays what price?
This summer, that Greece had
yes.
a very strong tourist season this summer. The economy in Greece is growing at 3%, and they were paying €30 spread. So our producers in south of Italy, like Enel among others, were very happy to sell energy with a €30 gain to Greece, thanks to our cable.
So I think the interconnection are beneficial to everybody. Okay, well, thank you very much. And now we give the floor to Mr. Merigo with a sort of keen interest in learning from the experience of the Marguerite Fund in financing these infrastructural projects. It's been a very innovative scheme, and but how much, even under sort of optimistic projection, can a scheme like Marguerite provide of the total investment needs in the infrastructural field, you know, and how can compare with the Juncker plan in terms of the ability to mobilize additional resources. Thank you, Mr. Merigo.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabrizio, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this important conference. I'm going to cover briefly the background and main achievements of the Marguerite Fund, my views on the current greenfield infrastructure investment environment, and some potential improvements. Marguerite is a long-term equity fund targeting primarily greenfield infrastructure fund in all the countries of the EU. It was launched 5 years ago by ECOFIN and designed by the founding members of the Long-Term Investor Club in collaboration with the European Commission. The fund has total commitments of 710 million euros, 100 million euros from each of the core sponsors, 80 million from the European Commission, and 30 million from other investors. The fund generally targets equity tickets of between 25 and 100 million euros. It has the ability to invest pre-construction or during construction. It can also acquire operating assets with significant new CapEx requirements. The fund has a 20-year life, and its investment horizon is generally more than 10 years. We also target minority stakes in general, so we're very attractive partners for industrial or strategic players and also financial investors. The sector focus is transport and energy infrastructure, including renewables. Our main achievements to date. Well, first of all, this is the first example of successful collaboration between the national development banks and the European Commission and the EIB in developing a new instrument for investing in infrastructure. To date, we have committed about half the fund to 10 investments across 8 countries, including 3 new member states in 6 subsectors. The portfolio today supports gross capital investment of 4.7 billion euros and associated equity of 1.2 billion euros by other investors with a leverage of 15 times and 4 times respectively. Therefore, Marguerite has provided a key part of the overall equity investment. The fund has played a catalytic role in all its projects, notably in the recent TEN-T Zagreb Airport in Croatia and the N17, N18 road transaction in Ireland, the Butendik offshore wind project in Germany, and the first energy from waste PPP project in Poland. Marguerite helped to attract private long-term capital to the 1.3 billion Butendik offshore wind project. It acted as anchor investor, attracting over 300 million euros of private capital from Danish pension funds and Siemens, together with project finance from EIB, KfW, and UniCredit. This was the largest renewable financing in Europe in 2013. Marguerite has built a strong reputation in the market, exemplified by winning 10 awards from leading project finance and infrastructure publications. And we have a broad network of industrial and financial partners, equipment suppliers, and lenders across Europe. So some views on the current greenfield infrastructure investment landscape. Generally speaking, I believe the pipeline in Europe is more constrained by lack of commercially viable projects than by lack of funds, either debt or equity. But this situation is, however, more complex. Projects with demand or traffic risk do face a real challenge to raise significant amounts of capital. Very few banks are comfortable with traffic risk, as they have been hit in the past, and capital markets or institutional investors struggle to offer a viable alternative, as these projects tend to be non-investment grade. Peripheral European countries such as Greece are still struggling with market capacity. Few banks are open to country risk, and generally with limited amounts and short maturities, 5 to 7 years, usually with hard mini-perm structures. A number of potential projects need to be further developed, scoped, and structured, which some countries are struggling to do through insufficient capacity or expertise in their domestic organization responsible for PPPs. Eurostat treatment can be a disincentive for some countries to pursue the PPP option in certain cases. This issue induces governments to consider less commercially viable projects for the PPP pipeline, which then either struggle to attract investors and/or require more expensive debt funding. The negative impact of the Eurostat treatment in the reduction of pipeline has not been consistent across Europe. However, the trend towards more transparency and harmonization of statistical and accounting treatment of PPPs may result in the future in most PPPs being on balance sheet. Energy sector projects, and in particular the interconnector or transmission projects, are generally not structured as PPPs and may be off limits to third-party investors because of unbundling rules or regulatory considerations that require such projects to be owned exclusively by TSOs. In renewable energy, some projects still face funding issues. For example, offshore wind still has a high perceived construction risk. So, potential improvements, and I think some of these have been largely addressed by the Juncker plan. More work can be done at EU level to help countries prepare a stable and predictable, viable project pipeline. So perhaps there's a role for an increased role for EPEC. For example, on acceptable clearance procedures to allow public sponsors to use public subsidies along contributions from the private sector in order to fund otherwise commercially unfeasible projects. Demand risk projects, which a number of countries do try to implement as they have less impact on public spending, require funding support, which is currently not available. To that extent, it would seem that the Juncker plan will allow the EIB to support such non-investment grade projects through expanding existing or new instruments. For strategic projects, one could consider a blanket exclusion from the excessive deficit procedure, or in other words, not count towards the budget deficit calculation of countries where this issue is probably most acute, but at the same time require significant investments to foster growth. Energy sector regulation should be revised to encourage third-party investment in priority subsector projects, not only at the corporate level or TSO level, but also directly at the project level. Another unconventional way to unlock projects that are strategic for the EU would be to use the Juncker plan to directly, partially fund subsidies and/or support through guarantees availability payments of projects that have clear economic benefits, but that individual states may struggle to finance. Finally, pipeline development costs, e.g. feasibility or traffic studies, should be included within the permitted use of the plan. There are few sponsors willing to participate in such expenses. At Marguerite, we expect to continue contributing to the development of a long-term infrastructure investment in Europe in collaboration with our sponsors, governments, investors, and industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolás. I think you've been very exhaustive in providing a lot of suggestions for increasing the feasibility or the financeability of projects in key infrastructural areas. And I think we have time for perhaps for a quick second, not second round, but perhaps if you want to interact with some of the points that have been made by the various speakers. And one thing I would like to ask perhaps Giovanni or Nicolás, I mean, we didn't talk too much about gas network, which is an important element in the infrastructural network, and I think it is as important, or perhaps even more than transport or electricity in many ways, particularly looking ahead with the problems that we have with the oil market and things like that. So, but I mean, we can have a second round of quick intervention, perhaps a couple of minutes each before we close. And Giovanni, would you like to?
Well, I think that gas, as it was shown very brilliantly by Matteo, is as critical in order to define a European energy policy. And in particular, it's not just about transport, but it's also about storage and LNG plants. And the concept of optimizing infrastructure investments across the continent is very important, in particular when there are so many concerns and growing concerns about the security of some of the supply lines. So there are opportunities related to the development of shale gas on one side, but on the other end there are, just to mention one opportunity, but there are as many concerns as the other. Now, I was mentioning in my speech that the concept of greenfield investments is something that can be defined as an equilibrium point between investments that companies like SNAM can do and dedicated infrastructure funds like Marguerite. There are intrinsic projects that see interest from financial sponsors like Marguerite and or from dedicated utility like SNAM. And I think that there are many examples of that. I'm thinking about storage as one, for example. Certainly a very interesting area, and as it was shown, one of the key aspects of further European integration. Nick, I don't know whether you want to add.
Well, just adding on to Giovanni's comments, I mean, gas infrastructure obviously has attracted a lot of attention recently because of the situation with the Ukraine and Russia, and has brought to light the enormous dependence on Russian gas. And of course, there are other ways of getting gas into Europe or producing gas within Europe that require large investments. LNG plants, for example, shale gas could be another alternative. So there's clearly a lot of focus right now on how to reduce the dependency on Russia. And there are a lot of projects that are going to probably be pushed forward because of that. The funds that were already approved for the 2014 budget period for DG Energy, I mean, some of those funds have already been unlocked, for example, for large interconnector projects between Poland and Lithuania. And it's clear that there is a big push to incorporate new channels or corridors of supply to more isolated regions in Europe. I mean, the gas sector in general, and I would say the electricity sector, because the European regulation is seen as quite stable and it's quite consistent across Europe, it does attract a lot of institutional investor capital, either through the stock markets, or in some cases because of private ownership. So there's a lot of interest in investing in these kind of businesses because of the track record and regulation across Europe. It's more challenging to attract that kind of money to greenfield projects, but those projects, once they're built and they're included in the respective gas system or electricity system within the TSOs, will attract financing or long-term capital from those type of institutional investors. So it's more a short-term issue of how you get the greenfield investment financed and built. And once it's in the system, it's usually quite straightforward to get financing for the TSO.
Sure, Carlo, please.
Just two quick remarks on this topic, which completes the picture with respect to the previous interventions. Well, first of all, gas storage was mentioned. I think it's a very interesting example of a kind of project which attracts a private capital, and under given circumstances. And as a matter of fact, in the experimental phase or pilot phase of the project bond initiative, one of the few projects beneficiary was a gas storage project, if I remember well, in Spain, or not in Italy in any case. Although there were discussions also for one in Italy, to be more precise. Second remark, this is also a very clear example of what needs to be done at the level of internal market, because we notice, we see in practice situations which are clearly showing the opposite situation. That is, for example, regasification plants in Spain being closed down for lack of demand, a huge need of gas in Italy, no possibility to carry it through France. So there is a lot of work also to be done on the regulatory level concerning a real unified market and not just...
No, maybe I will just try to emphasize a message that I would like to leave today. If we have a European energy roadmap 2050 that the European Council has just reconfirmed, that is projecting Europe to be independent from an energy standpoint, that means that from now to 2050 we will have more and more renewable capacity in Europe. And it would be probably windmills in Northern Europe, it would be more solar toward the south. But certainly this renewable production will be put not where you have the need of the energy, in terms of country and in terms of manufacturing and high energy absorption. So we need to build a grid. To build a grid, you have basically, when you have a European framework of different operators, which are quite big. Germany is a bit fragmented, but you know, France has a size which is similar to Italy, with very large operators. Thinking about putting from an equity and a market standpoint together the TSOs is a bit, I believe, a too ambitious plan. It would require a lot of resources. It would require to probably take off the market some of the operators such as Terna, which are on the market. So that project of putting as companies together in one company, the European operators, I believe is too ambitious. The shortcut is to work on the hardware, building more connections in between countries, cross-border, and then having Europe through the very strong presence of the organization of the TSOs to put the software above and make sure that the energy on the hardware that we have to build and to increase in terms of capacity, make sure that the energy flows.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have to conclude this session because we have to leave some space for the following roundtable, which is going to basically address the same issue, but with different speakers. But I think I like to sort of, pick up the point that Matteo just made, which is very important. I think in Europe we have traditionally aimed at being self-sufficient, each country to be self-sufficient in terms of energy, because we have a history of wars and conflicts, But obviously, we are now moving to an age in which, the location of the power plants has to be done, has to be in the place where it is most efficient, you know. So if there is wind, you have the windmills. If you have the sun, and you'll have the sort of the solar panel. So I think that is quite a change in the philosophy that you know, the industry has been adopting until now, and we hope that you know, the pressure of rebuilding our infrastructures and creating a push on the demand side of our economies will provide the incentive for addressing these issues in a constructive and hopefully rapid way. Well, thank you very much to the panelists. They have been very good. I hope you join me in an applause. Moving to the concluding panel of this session. And I mean, the theme of the panel is not very much different from what we discussed earlier on. I mean, we're talking again, financing the trans-European network, the state of the art. And I think we have here, I see there is one panelist missing, but I think we have here Nicky Edwards, Director of the Policy and Public Affairs for the CITYUK, and then Eric Perée, Associate Director of Institutional Strategy at the EIB. So as we are running, as usual, a bit short of time, I will not introduce the speakers any longer than that. I think the issues on the table are quite clear. So I will start giving the floor to Nicky as giving your point of view on the financing of infrastructures, particularly in the area of the trans-European networks, which we have been discussing until now. Please.
At the start of this morning's session, at what feels like not just a discussion about long-term finance, but quite a long-term discussion about long-term finance, Commissioner Hill got proceedings underway by talking about Capital Markets Union as something of all 28 member states. And in the terms of infrastructure, he also made the point that infrastructure is not an end in itself. It's not something that delivers the public goods we want to see on its own. It only serves the public good if it enables competitiveness that deliver jobs and growth. There is no appetite to build bridges to nowhere or roads to nowhere. In order for there to be deep, liquid, single market for capital, we have to remove barriers. And during the course of today, we have heard about a number of the barriers to a deep, liquid, single market for capital that serves all 28 member states. One of the other themes of today has been the partnership between the public and the private sectors. We know the scale of Europe's need, the 600 billion funding gap by 2030. We know that the reality is that public finance cannot fill that gap. That's not going to be the future of infrastructure projects. The constraints on government finance are in place for the foreseeable future. So the partnership between the public and the private sector is going to be a very important one. And in the context of Juncker's plan to use 315 billion euros as the seed from which germinates the full range of infrastructure spending that we want, the crucial obstacles to making that public-private partnership work have to be addressed and removed. The experience in the UK, from where I come, of public-private partnerships is a long one. I am not here in any way as a salesperson for our experience. I think it has elements both of how to do things, but also how not to do things. One of the advantages of having been in this model for a long time is that we have learnt some of the ways that you can have unintended consequences. Where we are in Britain is that we have now got to private finance too, in which the government attempts to evolve the public-private partnership model and learn from some of the past projects that perhaps didn't go quite so well. We know that the worldwide construction market is worth $7.5 trillion a year, and that dwarfs the capacity of individual states or even groups of states to fund. Public-private partnerships are now global, with over 100 countries looking at how to introduce them, and 40 countries now having some form of PPP unit. And that's something that I want to come back to, because this is not just a question of capital to deliver these projects. There's also a very important element of human capital, of expertise and know-how that goes beyond the engineers who deliver the infrastructure projects, or even from the financial services sector which finances them. There is a whole ecosystem of professional infrastructure and support to enable these deals to be done and these projects to be built. In order for them to be successful, PPPs need a clear structure that balances the risks taken by the private sector with the appropriate rewards, and also gives clarity about what the risks are from the outset and how they'll be apportioned. How PF2, which is the current state of Britain's approach to this, came about is that we essentially reviewed and looked back at our experience and have come up with, the government has come up with something that continues to draw on the private experience, but also build the expertise of the public sector as an enabler and a commissioner. There is a focus on asset design and construction with responsibility for maintenance and renewal in a single contract to bind in the investors over the life of a contract. There's a recognition that models need to become more flexible and to provide greater discretion over what's included in a project. And it's important that everyone is incentivized properly. One of the inhibitions to finance in this area is that there can be a short-termism in how success is measured and how rewards are attributed. So proper incentives and proper measurement of success are very important. In terms of long-term and cross-border infrastructure, I think one of the interesting examples is the Channel Tunnel rail link, a cross-border project that's complex, large-scale, brings in private engineering and building companies, but also enabled results to be delivered on time and on budget. And one of the important factors in that was the role of government guarantees in mitigating the market risk for private investors. So, the partnership element of public-private partnerships is very important. Governments, whether individual member states or collectively, have a really crucial role in selecting suitable projects, in defining the objectives from the outset, enabling the proper structures to be put in place before they begin procurement, and to negotiate the optimal risk transfer. The private sector brings to this a commitment to serve their investors and their customers by optimizing the return on investment. We should never lose sight, as we have been told a number of times during today, of the customer, the individual whose pension savings, whose personal savings, whose family wealth is tied up in the success of these long-term plays to meet their needs for an income in retirement, say, over the course of 30 years. So the private sector serves that customer and defines a competitive bid that enables them to match their assets with their liabilities. I'd like to conclude with an idea of something that the EU might think of to enable this to be done better, which is perhaps that there could be a European PPP Centre of Excellence for collaboration and communication, maybe as an office in Brussels, as a joint initiative of the EIB and the Commission, to share experience and best practice, to publish policy, guidance and statistics on PPPs, because we know that the quality of information about what is planned and what is delivered is absolutely crucial, and that such a collaboration could advise on infrastructure projects, enable them to be joined up and create a proper single market for such projects.
Thank you very much, Nicky. It is very interesting, and particularly this proposal, it's indeed a pragmatic contribution to the debate, and I think it resonates a little bit with the proposal that was in this Chatham House report, where they suggested that there is a need for some sort of coordination and vetting of PPPs, procedures and implementation. Okay, but now I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker from the European Investment Bank, and I think, of course, we are very much interested in having directly from you the view of what is the role of the EIB within the context of this sort of broad Juncker plan, and how do you feel about the prospect of using a rather significant leveraging ratio, also in view of the constraints that are very strong within the shareholders of the EIB, and rightly so, that the EIB keeps its AAA rating in the markets, being such a major player. So, Eric, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have some good news, because it was just said that there should be something to spread the knowledge and the information, best practice on PPPs. That things already exist, so we are already delivering, but probably failing in our ability to communicate well to all stakeholders that this exists. It's called the European PPP Expertise Center, EPEC in short. All the information that it publishes is on the EIB website, and the most recent document, I think, released today was on the Eurostat treatments of PPPs in the new statistical framework, ESA 10. But there are a host of other issues for PPPs, good practice that have been published there. You know, what is the role of the PPP units in the various member states, or to organize that? And I'm not going to list, but you go there and you will see the catalog of information that is available. And it's a joint initiative of the EIB and the Commission. And a number of member states are also involved through their PPP center at home. But I take the point that we have to communicate better to be seen, and that this is put to good.
Probably people feel that this is an oil-producing organization, APEC, you know, it sounds...
Yeah, okay. But maybe let's zoom a bit wider than PPPs. A number of things have been said on the Juncker plan throughout the day, and well, there were some positives and some not so positive comments, and kind of way to put the, let's say, the negative comments together. I think it was said it was too little, too late, with too little public resource. I want somehow to dispel that feeling that it's really so poor. Of course, as always, you can have the view that, okay, we would be in a better position elsewhere, but we have to start from where we are. So we have an idea what should be the end point, and there are a number of constraints, political constraints certainly, that are framing those, the Juncker plan. So the Juncker plan has to be seen as an EU-level response of the European Commission, well, and the EU machinery, together with the IB, of what can be done and what can be delivered with the means we have. So if someone tells me, oh, well, there is a part of 250 billion euros available somewhere, yeah, then we will have a different plan, but we have some constraints. So, and certainly one point or a takeaway from today is that a number of speakers have said that finance is not in itself the issue. There is a lot of finance available. The format we can debate, but the amount of finance is simply there. ECB is very accommodative. A lot of institutional investors have money to put to work. The thing is to make it happen and to have finance in the right format. But the thing, well, the first bottleneck is really having projects. And I think this has been said by a number of speakers. And I will not claim that the EIB has a magic recipe to get those projects, but certainly the task force on project identification led by the Commission and the EIB and associating all the member states has tried to make sense. Do we have projects? Okay? Some people have said, well, we don't need any plans for investment because there are no projects. There is no need even to discuss financing. The projects are not there. The survey that was made by the task force has identified a couple of thousand projects for a total cost of investment of 1.3 trillion euros. That's long term, but even in the next 3 years, the kind of investment needs or investment cost of the project identified is in excess of €500 billion. This doesn't mean that all those projects are ready for implementation, but we have a list. We can work on that basis. We can now start to prioritize to see what needs to be done to get those projects moving. So I think we have somehow made some steps along the road of getting rid of this question, we have no project. Obviously, we have those projects. We need to get them to the market to prepare them. And it was said this morning also that this advisory hub, trying to have technical assistance and to prepare better those projects, that is essential. And this is an addition. Well, the EIB has managed some technical facilities. Well, Jaspers is one, but those things we know matter. And here there is a big push to get this infrastructure advisory hub really delivering. Let me now zoom a bit on the issue of the mixing of public and private resource. I agree fully. That's so common sense that since we have huge public deficit and public debt constraint, that we will not necessarily have as much public money available for putting together projects in the future. But the huge challenge is not just to replace public money with private money, it's to get the alchemy right. And it's not just a question of, addition, okay? You have 100 billion less public sector, you replace that by 100 billion of private money. Now, the way projects are seen, the way the money is put to work, the way you need to structure projects, all those things are different. And I think the challenge really is for the public sector, and this is an absolutely gigantic challenge, to change the frame of mind, to have the view that with less money, we need to really invest the money where it makes a difference. Additionality is the key, and I think it's a word that we should all have very much on the top of our mind when we discuss those issues. The second is that probably in this whole debate, when we discuss financing, we forget about one issue. Someone, somewhere, has to pay. And basically, if you have public money that is not looking to get a return, the public sector is paying for that up front, But if you get private financier to come and to finance the piece of infrastructure, and you have just availability-based payment, and PPPs in Europe are to the tune of 70% or so financed or organized that way, it's still the public sector that pays in the end. Okay, so we have to ask, well, where are the boundaries of the public sector, not just in finance, but more broadly? And of course, then you have the question of value for money. But those are also social choice, and it's very difficult. Maybe just to finish, I would want just to give a positive signal in the very end. I've been on the circuit discussing long-term investment for 5 or 6 years. 5, 6 years ago, no one was interested. Now this issue has moved to the very top of the political agenda in the EU, but in the G20 as well. And frankly, now we do see long-term institutional investors putting money on the table. The large players have gone into financing infrastructure. The kind of next step and where we need to be attentive is that the second-tier players, mid-sized insurance companies that cannot have really their own way to develop the teams for that. I think we need to find ways to bring them on board, and certainly the approval under the Italian presidency of the European Long-Term Investment Fund framework is probably a very good news in that respect. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I would like to conclude this panel. We have here the Minister of Finance of Italy, and I know he's pressed for time, so I will not try to sum up the conclusions. We have had a very thorough discussion, and I will leave the floor immediately to Mr. Padoan, the Minister of Finance of Italy.
He is an Italian finance minister, and once my colleague at the OECD, you have to leave soon, you leave a bit earlier. So I jump on to giving you the floor just now.
Grazie Rintaro, buonasera a tutti, è un vero piacere essere qui per scambiare alcune idee su questa nuova fase della politica per gli investimenti in Europa. Come diceva il mio caro amico Rintaro, purtroppo io dovrò lasciarvi subito, c'è un Consiglio dei Ministri che comincia tra poco e ovviamente devo essere lì. Fatemi dire innanzitutto che il piano di investimento, il piano Juncker, è una misura molto opportuna. Si inserisce in un contesto nel quale l'economia europea fatica a riprendere una crescita sostenuta. Direi di più, l'economia europea mostra rischi che invece di allentarsi diventano più pressanti in termini di crescita appunto che striscia sul fondo, per così dire, e andamento dei prezzi che è molto basso e rischia di diventare negativo. E quindi è estremamente importante che ci siano misure di sostegno agli investimenti in Europa, investimenti che sono la variabile che è venuta mancando sia a livello di investimento privato che a livello di investimento pubblico da molto tempo. E gli investimenti, dico una banalità ma vale la pena di ricordarla, sono allo stesso tempo una variabile che sostiene la domanda e che sostiene l'offerta, soprattutto nel medio periodo, e quindi riconcilia visioni apparentemente contrapposte della natura della crisi e delle misure necessarie. Io vorrei soffermarmi su 2 punti molto rapidamente. fare qualche considerazione su che cosa serve affinché il piano Juncker o il piano di investimento, per essere più precisi, possa essere efficace, e in secondo luogo che cosa si debba fare a livello di politiche nazionali, con una particolare attenzione all'Italia, affinché i Paesi possano approfittare al meglio del piano Juncker. Che cosa serve al piano Juncker? Beh, innanzitutto, e questo è stato detto già prima dallo speaker che mi ha preceduto, un piano del genere deve mettere assieme buoni progetti con risorse per finanziarli. Questa polemica, se servono più soldi o se servono più progetti, è andata avanti per molto tempo. Secondo me è una polemica in sé sterile, servono ovviamente tutti e due. E quindi servono meccanismi che incentivano la produzione di buoni progetti, sia a livello pubblico che a livello privato. Questo mi porta a dire che il primo criterio di cui il piano Juncker ha bisogno è che siano chiari i criteri con i quali le risorse che andranno ad alimentare il piano stesso, questi criteri siano specificati con precisione. Questo naturalmente sarà compito delle discussione più tecnica che deve seguire, ma naturalmente poi dovrà essere implementato con precisione. Qui c'è naturalmente una doppia dimensione: i progetti devono essere profittevoli, devono essere market proof, ma devono anche evidentemente tener conto della distribuzione tra i vari membri delle risorse. Una seconda condizione che secondo me è importante è che bisogna fare presto, e questo perché la crisi non cessa, non se ne esce, e naturalmente ci vogliono parecchi mesi affinché un meccanismo come quello del piano Juncker possa diventare operativo. Rischiano di essere tanti, ma nel frattempo si può fare già qualcosa. E qui penso al ruolo della BEI. Come di nuovo è stato ricordato prima, la BEI e la Commissione hanno guidato una task force istituita durante la presidenza italiana, che ha individuato un pacchetto di progetti estremamente ampio. Al valore facciale questi progetti valgono 1.300 miliardi. Naturalmente non tutti sono probabilmente finanziabili, ma è importante che si sia iniziato questo sforzo di selezione dei progetti, perché questo è un passo che non finisce con il lavoro di questa task force, ma auspicabilmente mette in moto presso i vari Paesi meccanismi di selezione più efficiente dei progetti medesimi. Quindi qualcosa si potrebbe fare già da subito: si prendano tra i progetti in questa lista quelli considerati più validi, si mobilizzino risorse che già ci sono, per esempio presso la BEI, con modalità magari un po' più aggressive, se posso usare in questo termine, in senso buono, quello che si dice in inglese risk appetite. La terza condizione che mi pare fondamentale affinché il piano Juncker dia buoni frutti è che ci devono essere altre misure a livello europeo affinché gli investimenti crescano e si moltiplichino. E questo ha a che fare con le misure nazionali, di cui poi parlerò, e penso soprattutto alle riforme strutturali, e a livello europeo, e lì penso soprattutto al mercato interno. Queste sono misure che in sé non si traducono immediatamente in investimenti, ma creano opportunità di investimento. Una strategia di crescita deve avere gli investimenti come volano, ma deve anche produrre un ambiente favorevole agli investimenti, che deve essere cercato, ripeto, sia a livello nazionale che a livello europeo. E sicuramente il mercato interno è un'agenda rimasta a metà da quando è partita più di 2 decenni fa. un mercato interno dell'energia non esiste, non esiste un mercato interno digitale e così via. È tempo che il cosiddetto capitale politico dei governi europei si sposti dalle sfide che fino adesso ha dovuto affrontare in termini di gestione della crisi finanziaria, di costruzione dell'unione bancaria, si sposti per far dare un nuovo stimolo al mercato interno. Quarto fattore, ce ne sono molti altri, ma mi fermo qui, che secondo me è indispensabile per far partire il piano Juncker presto, è il meccanismo che dovrebbe portare a ulteriori immissioni di fondi nel fondo Juncker da parte degli Stati nazionali. Lo dico molto chiaramente tenuto conto dell'incarico che ricopro in questo momento. È naturalmente una bellissima idea avere un fondo europeo. I paesi, e sono più o meno tutti, che devono fare i conti con bilanci sotto forte pressione, devono anche avere chiari incentivi al voler trasferire fondi presso il nuovo meccanismo. In questo senso è molto importante che la Commissione presto chiarisca la questione della valutazione ai fini del patto di stabilità degli eventuali conferimenti di fondi. Questo può avvenire in vari modi, è importante che questo sia chiarito. Se ne possono elencare altre di condizioni, per esempio avrei in mente nell'ambito sotto il capitolo mercato interno e altre misure strutturali il continuare nello sforzo di quella che adesso nel dibattito recente viene chiamata Capital Markets Union, Unione dei mercati dei capitali, cioè una ulteriore integrazione dei mercati finanziari in tutta l'Unione Europea, quindi non solo nell'area euro, allo scopo di diversificare gli strumenti di finanziamento e per questa via fornire ulteriori munizioni allo strumento del piano Juncker. Fin qui quello che dovrebbe essere secondo me fatto, ripeto, molte altre cose, ma alcune cose fondamentali a livello europeo, e quindi il compito delle istituzioni europee farsene carico. Ma poi c'è un'agenda implicita, che almeno io ritengo ci debba essere, che ogni Paese si deve dare per poter sfruttare al meglio il piano Juncker medesimo, cioè più risorse per gli investimenti. E permettetemi di menzionarle avendo chiaramente in mente il caso italiano. Innanzitutto bisogna accrescere le opportunità di investimento e qui di nuovo l'agenda di riforme strutturali è fondamentale. Le riforme strutturali di per sé generano un mutamento nel funzionamento dei mercati, quindi aprono opportunità che prima non c'erano e di conseguenza possono permettere di prendere in considerazione progetti di investimento che prima non c'erano. Da qui la necessità di accelerare l'agenda delle riforme strutturali, in particolare in un Paese come l'Italia, dove gli impedimenti strutturali agli investimenti sono andati aumentando da 2 decenni più o meno. Quindi la crisi italiana non riflette solo la pesantissima recessione degli ultimi anni, ma riflette un problema che viene da lontano, e cioè ostacoli strutturali agli investimenti. Una seconda condizione riguarda il percorso del consolidamento fiscale, che chiaramente per un Paese ad alto debito è fondamentale, e questo ovviamente deve essere confermato anche per mantenere la fiducia dei mercati, ma con un elemento in più, che nella valutazione del processo di aggiustamento di bilancio si deve tener conto non soltanto della dimensione stessa dei grandi aggregati, della dinamica del deficit e quindi della dinamica del debito, ma anche la qualità dell'aggiustamento. Come si usano i soldi dello Stato del bilancio? Si usano per spese che sostengono anch'esse gli investimenti e quindi possono essere complementari al progetto Juncker oppure no? La struttura dell'imposizione fiscale, anche a parità di gettito, si può cambiare per sostenere gli investimenti oppure no? La risposta è sì. Quindi avendo a disposizione in Europa una opportunità di investimento più elevata, bisogna, secondo me, anche adeguare la composizione del bilancio, pur in un contesto ovviamente di consolidamento continuo. Un ulteriore elemento è la dimensione italiana della questione del mercato dei capitali. Come tutti sapete, il finanziamento all'economia in Italia è stato a lungo tempo, se non esclusivamente, in grandissima parte fornito dalle banche. Le banche ovviamente devono continuare a farlo, però è anche il momento di diversificare gli strumenti finanziari attraverso misure che incentivino, per esempio, l'ingresso sul mercato del finanziamento all'economia di soggetti non bancari, per esempio gli investitori a lungo termine, incentivino dal lato dell'offerta di strumenti finanziari il comportamento delle imprese in direzione, per esempio, di strumenti come i mini bonds e quant'altro. Tutte queste cose ampliano il portafoglio di strumenti e quindi permettono, tra l'altro, un più efficace collegamento fra decisioni di investimento private e una decisione di investimento che ha una provenienza di tipo pubblico, come il piano Juncker dice. E infine, ultimo ma non ultimo, le banche di promozione nazionale, se questo è il termine che traduce National Promotional Banks, possono e sono in grado, e secondo me dovrebbero dare un contributo fondamentale proprio in questo nuovo contesto, affiancando, rafforzando o facendo delle iniziative proprie a quello che viene dal piano Juncker. Tutte queste cose insieme producono, e io di questo ne sono abbastanza convinto, un clima molto diverso e comincerebbero a produrre risultati anche molto presto. Ci sarebbe un ulteriore vantaggio, forse più intangibile, meno identificabile quantitativamente, ma secondo me estremamente importante dal punto di vista qualitativo, che nella misura in cui si riesce a costruire un programma per il sostegno degli investimenti e della crescita articolato su vari strumenti come quello che ricordavo, questo avrebbe un effetto molto importante sulle aspettative, perché i mercati, le imprese, che alla fine sono quelli che devono fare la gran parte degli investimenti, potrebbero riconoscere un segnale positivo dal lato della politica, sia essa politica europea che politica nazionale. Questo sarebbe un ingrediente aggiuntivo importantissimo per sostenere gli investimenti, perché darebbe un senso a un orizzonte di lungo termine. In fondo il piano Juncker si chiama ufficialmente, se non sbaglio, piano per l'investimento a lungo termine, e di questo si parla in questo convegno. Un elemento essenziale affinché il lungo termine prevalga è esattamente credere che nel lungo termine ci saranno risultati positivi. La politica oggi più che mai ha la responsabilità di dare una prospettiva a lungo termine e quindi accentuare l'impiego delle risorse che magari ci sono, però non sono utilizzate perché appunto manca la fiducia. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Pier, Carlo, Minister Padoan, on your thoughtful idea about Juncker's plan and its Italian context. Thank you very much. Now, I'm giving the floor to French Finance Minister, Monsieur Michel Sapin. Monsieur Sapin, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Comme je vais utiliser la langue française, je sais que beaucoup d'entre vous la connaissent. Merci Franco de ton amitié, de ta présence et de cette invitation. Je vous laisse à chacun le temps de mettre vos casques. Je vois que peu mettent le casque, donc je vous remercie de comprendre tous la langue française. Le sujet que nous abordons est évidemment un sujet d'une éminente actualité. Je dirais même qu'il est d'urgence. Pas seulement parce qu'il y a un plan Juncker, j'y reviendrai, pas seulement parce que la Commission européenne souhaite prendre dans ce domaine-là des initiatives qui sont bienvenues, mais parce que, je parle de la Commission européenne, et c'est à ce moment-là que la Commission rentre, comme quoi tout ceci est parfaitement huilé. Bonjour Pierre, merci d'être présent. Donc pas seulement parce que la Commission européenne, elle va nous dire pourquoi présente un plan de cette nature, mais parce que répondre à un besoin aujourd'hui fondamental d'investissement, et en particulier d'investissement de long terme en Europe, c'est répondre à un des problèmes principaux qui explique aujourd'hui la faible croissance et la diminution de la capacité de croissance à venir de notre continent par rapport aux autres grands continents du monde. Chacun a en tête, ça a déjà été cité, et je vais parler ici en redisant un certain nombre de choses que Pierre, Carlo, Padoan a déjà dit, ce qui montre que nous avons une très grande proximité de pensée et de propositions. Chacun connaît le déficit d'investissement public et privé que notre continent européen connaît par rapport à la période d'avant la grande crise financière. Je dis bien public et privé. Certains des pays de l'Europe ont pu maintenir un certain niveau d'investissement public, mais ont vu s'écrouler leur investissement privé. D'autres pays ont vu baisser et l'investissement privé et l'investissement public. Au total, aujourd'hui, un déficit considérable qui explique une grande partie des difficultés de l'Europe. La deuxième chose, c'est que face à cette situation de très faible croissance, de très faible inflation, et parfois même le mot de très faible inflation n'est plus exact, il est passé en dessous de zéro, et face, dans beaucoup de nos pays, c'est le cas en Italie comme en France, mais dans beaucoup d'autres pays européens, de très fort chômage, il nous faut adapter nos politiques économiques et monétaires à la situation. La politique monétaire, elle a été adaptée par la Banque centrale européenne. Je ne vais pas ici, bien entendu, la commenter. On voit bien que cette Banque centrale a encore des capacités d'agir. Mais pour reprendre un terme parfaitement exact de Mario Draghi, la politique monétaire ne peut pas tout à elle seule. Il faut donc aussi adapter les autres outils d'une politique équilibrée et efficace, que ce soit au niveau d'un pays, comme ce soit au niveau d'un continent ou d'une zone monétaire comme celle de l'eurozone. Les autres éléments, ce sont évidemment le pilier budgétaire et le pilier des réformes structurelles. Les réformes structurelles, il appartient à chacun des pays de mener les réformes qui sont nécessaires compte tenu de sa situation économique, sociale, de son organisation économique et sociale. C'est ce que fait l'Italie, c'est ce que fait la France, ce que font d'autres pays. Il ne suffit pas de le dire, il faut le faire. Vous le faites, nous allons le faire. Mais il y a aussi la politique budgétaire. La politique budgétaire, ça n'est pas un monstre sacré. Ça n'est pas une politique qui serait inchangeable, inadaptable à l'évolution des situations. Non pas que nous soyons aujourd'hui dans une situation qui nécessite de renverser la table budgétairement. Je veux dire par là que nous ne sommes évidemment pas dans une situation où, comme en 2008-2009, il faudrait tout d'un coup rentrer dans un plan de relance globalement. Ce serait mauvais, inadapté, dangereux même pour l'équilibre de notre zone monétaire. Mais nous sommes dans une situation budgétaire où il faut adapter nos réductions de déficit ou nos objectifs de réduction de dette, pour prendre des pays de nature différente, ou en tout cas où les problèmes se posent de manière différente, à la situation économique elle-même. Et ce que la Commission a introduit comme débat, je suis persuadé que Pierre comme Moscovici souhaitera approfondir ce sujet, c'est-à-dire d'analyser la situation budgétaire globale de l'ensemble des pays de l'eurozone et l'effet de ces politiques budgétaires juxtaposées sur l'ensemble de l'eurozone, c'est la bonne manière de voir les choses pour ensuite en tirer des conséquences pays par pays en fonction de la situation de chacun de ces pays. Il faut donc avoir d'une manière ou d'une autre une politique budgétaire moins restrictive que précédemment et, si je voulais être positif, plus stimulante pour l'économie qu'elle ne l'était précédemment. Mais comme ça n'est pas n'importe comment, comme ça n'est pas par la relance de la consommation dont on sait bien qu'aujourd'hui elle n'aurait pas d'effet, l'investissement est évidemment le bon outil qui permet à la fois de soutenir l'activité et la demande immédiatement, tout en faisant le pont, j'allais dire, avec les réformes de structure, de l'investissement de structure a quelque chose à voir, même si ce n'est pas une logique automatique, avec les réformes de structure. Le truc qu'il y a à voir, c'est la capacité en profondeur de nos économies à être plus porteurs de croissance, plus porteurs d'emploi, plus porteurs de capacité à résoudre nos problèmes. D'où cette nécessité absolue de faire en sorte que, à la fois, nous préservions nos capacités d'investissement dans chacun de nos pays, quel que soit par ailleurs le rythme de réduction de nos déficits, et que nous puissions nous appuyer sur un certain nombre d'initiatives, d'outils, comme par exemple le plan Juncker, pour mettre en œuvre de la manière la plus pertinente possible et la plus rapide possible des programmes d'investissement qui soient adaptés à nos situations et à nos situations personnelles. Bien entendu, et il faut toujours éviter les clichés, il y a toujours un cliché qui voudrait qu'il y ait les partisans de l'investissement public d'un côté et les partisans de l'investissement privé de l'autre. Non. Je décrivais la situation européenne. En Europe, il y a moins d'investissement public qu'en 2007, mais il y a beaucoup moins d'investissement privé qu'en 2007. Il faut donc évidemment faire en sorte que ce soit l'ensemble qui retrouve un niveau, qui soit un niveau adapté aux besoins de notre société et de notre économie. C'est d'abord et avant toute chose l'investissement privé qui doit être stimulé, mais chacun sait bien que s'il suffisait cela, les projets seraient déjà financés. Il voit bien qu'il faut à la fois bien choisir les projets, mais qu'il faut le petit plus, qui peut ne pas être si petit que cela, d'investissement public ou de garantie publique, qui fait qu'un projet qui n'était pas financé jusque-là parce qu'il n'était pas finançable, devient finançable parce qu'il devient rentable et il devient accessible, bien entendu, aux investissements privés concernés. C'est cet équilibre-là que nous devons définir, soutenir. Il n'y a pas l'Allemagne qui ne voudrait que de l'investissement privé et, je prends au hasard, la France qui ne voudrait que de l'investissement public. Nous devons marier les deux de manière à avoir une plus grande efficacité et permettre à l'ensemble des capacités d'investissement qui existent, on le sait aujourd'hui, de trouver des débouchés, de trouver les projets, de mettre en œuvre des projets qui deviennent rentables compte tenu de l'initiative publique. C'est ça l'équilibre global des investissements, aussi bien au niveau de chacun de nos pays que dans le cadre du plan Juncker. Ce sont des questions aussi, vous en avez parlé je crois avec Lord Hill, des questions de réglementation adaptée entre la prévention des risques et en même temps la capacité à prendre des risques de la part des marchés. Ce sont des questions qui touchent aussi au développement, par exemple, de la titrisation, une titrisation de qualité qui permette à notre système bancaire de trouver d'autres nouvelles possibilités pour investir. Donc il y a aussi des questions qui sont des questions de réglementation. Enfin, je voudrais insister, comme l'a fait Pierre Carlo, sur ce qui me paraît être la question principale. Je disais qu'il y a urgence. Si nous n'agissons pas vite, cette situation, que je n'appellerai pas une crise, mais cette situation extrêmement dommageable pour nos pays de très faible croissance, très faible inflation pendant trop longtemps, est une situation qui peut évidemment durer et avoir des conséquences sociales et économiques presque aussi graves qu'une crise brutale dont parfois on a le sentiment qu'on peut sortir ou rebondir. Il y a donc vraiment un risque. Il est identifié, ce risque. Il y a donc urgence à agir. Urgence à agir. Et donc il faut, y compris au niveau européen, que les propositions qui sont faites puissent être affinées, précisées dans ces modalités de financement comme dans ces modalités de choix des projets rapidement. J'ai l'habitude de dire, nous ne demandons pas que les 300 milliards, les 315 milliards du plan Juncker soient dépensés en 2015, mais il ne faut pas attendre 2017 pour que les 300 milliards eux-mêmes soient dépensés et mis en œuvre. Il y a urgence à faire en sorte que dès 2015, une partie de ces capacités d'investissement trouve des débouchés pour permettre à nos pays de retrouver progressivement le chemin de cette croissance, à la fois par la réalité des investissements et, comme le disait très bien Pierre Carlo, par des anticipations meilleures de la part des marchés et des investisseurs et de nos économies qui nous remettent dans une dynamique de croissance et dans une dynamique de confiance.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Sapin. Now, the last speaker of the day, EU Commissioner Pierre Moscovici. Monsieur Moscovici, the floor is yours.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. We'll start by some words in English and come back to a language I know better. It's a real pleasure for me to speak in front of you today, the first day of this conference. I'm sure it has been very fruitful in bringing together academic investors and policymakers from Europe and from the member states around one subject: how to make long-term investment in Europe happen in concrete terms on the ground. If we come back to economics, investment is a series of individual microeconomic decisions which are the pulsing blood of the economy. Taken together and accumulated over time, these decisions produce and constantly regenerate the backbone of our economies. And I would like today to share some thoughts on this macroeconomic side of investment. As European Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, the macroeconomic context in which investment happens or does not happen is one of my main concern and also priorities. And I believe the European authorities, together with member states, can have a large influence on this context. And let me tell you briefly how. First, where is the European economy today? I will be brief on that because I broadly share what Michel just said a few minutes ago. We are at this very decisive point. We experienced 5 or 6 years of zero average growth since the beginning of the crisis. Our forecasts say that a very low and slow recovery is on the way, but we know it's still very fragile and vulnerable to external shock. In 2017, the crisis will be a decade old. And so what is the main challenge to us? Not to accept low inflation as a definite point, not to accept low growth, to fight high unemployment and raising inequalities. And if we don't, this decade would have been lost, and we could have even a longer period of wasted time. My view of economic policy making at the current juncture is that we have to think in terms of risk management and security margins. We therefore cannot count on spontaneous recovery. Waiting for it will at best bring disappointment and disappointing low growth. At the same time, we should not risk reversing one of the main achievements of the past couple of years, the stabilization of the Eurozone, and through credible fiscal and financial consolidation in a context of very high public and private debt almost everywhere in Europe. So our challenge is therefore to kickstart economic growth in Europe again without reversing financial stabilization. That's the way I would sum up the point where we are. In this context, let me underline 2 elements which to me constitute the starting point we have to build in the near future. The first element is the comprehensive assessment of the European banking system by the ECB. With the banking union for which we fought so hard, now fully functional, on the situation of the banking system in Europe, the European economy now can rely on a sound financial system to grow again. The second element is very important and it's decisive, even we spoke about that in the last Eurogroup meeting, is the now neutral fiscal stance in Europe and in the euro area as a whole. For the last years, obviously it was recessive. Now it's neutral. The Commission and the Eurogroup have taken stock of the fact that we are there. It is welcome at this stage, and I consider at the European Commission that as an appropriate balance between sustainability requirements, which are still, of course, necessary, and current weak cyclical conditions, which need to be addressed. These 2 elements with the current economic situation embody to me the fact that we are entering in 2015 in a new economic sequence. In this new economic sequence, growth is possible. Again, investment will be the key. Alors, tout le monde sait que l'Europe souffre d'un large investment gap, d'un large fossé d'investissement ou déficit d'investissement. Ça veut dire que ça fait plusieurs années que nous avons une pénurie d'investissement en Europe. Si on regarde les chiffres, aujourd'hui, chaque année, les Européens investissent 20% de moins qu'en 2008. Et évidemment, ça pénalise notre continent si on le compare à d'autres. Un continent, une économie, une nation qui n'investit pas ne prépare pas son avenir, ce qui, dans une économie mondialisée, bien sûr, la conduit petit à petit au déclassement. Et je suis persuadé que ce déficit d'investissement est une des causes majeures du déficit de croissance que nous avons à affronter. Mesurer cet investment gap, ce déficit d'investissement, c'est très difficile. Une chose est sûre, je vais me risquer à un chiffrage vraiment plus qu'approximatif, c'est certainement plusieurs centaines de milliards d'euros, probablement 1000 milliards d'euros. J'irai jusque-là. Et ça résulte à la fois d'un processus multi-annuel de sous-investissement, et ça fait seulement quelques mois que le sujet est sur la table. Comme membre du Parlement français, je l'étais encore il y a quelques semaines, j'étais venu ici en Italie, j'avais rencontré Franco Bassanini, j'ai eu l'occasion de travailler là-dessus. Et je dirais que ce que la Commission fait, c'est indispensable et c'est un début. Tu parlais de 315 milliards d'euros sur 3 ans, je pense qu'on est au bon rythme. Je pense aussi, mais je vais y revenir, qu'on ne peut pas s'arrêter là, qu'il faudra poursuivre. Et je pense enfin, et je vais y revenir également, qu'il faut aller vite, bien sûr, parce que les exigences, les attentes sont très fortes tout de suite. Alors, quelle peut être une stratégie efficace d'investissement pour l'Europe? Il faudrait, à mon sens, et il faudra suivre quelques principes. Premier principe, il faut que ce soit des nouveaux projets, pas uniquement des projets qui auraient trouvé de toute façon un financement. Ce n'est pas forcément de la new money, mais ça doit être des nouveaux projets. Deuxièmement, il faut que ça aille vite, que ce soit rapide. Sinon, la déception sera à la hauteur de l'espoir ou de l'attente qui est créée. Troisièmement, ça doit être ciblé. Et vous avez, je crois, parlé aujourd'hui des principaux thèmes ou des principales cibles possibles. Je dirais simplement qu'il faut que ce soit des emplois de demain qui soient financés, le numérique, les transports du futur, les mobilités du futur, l'énergie, la transition énergétique, le capital humain en général, la recherche, l'innovation, etc. Et quatrième principe, je m'en tiens là pour le moment, le plan doit s'appuyer aussi bien sur de l'argent privé que sur de l'argent public. Il faut qu'il y ait des investissements publics et privés. J'ai utilisé une formule à plusieurs reprises, je vous la donne ici, vous ne l'avez pas encore entendue, puisque j'ai utilisé ailleurs. Il faut autant d'investissements privés que possible, mais il faut des investissements publics quand c'est nécessaire. Et je vais, comme Michel, m'abstenir de dire où c'est nécessaire et qui doit faire quoi. Alors, le plan d'investissement dit Juncker, je pense, constitue une réponse déterminée et j'espère décisive à ces défis. Il y a un triangle là pour l'investissement. D'abord, il faut mobiliser des financements et donc utiliser les instruments dont nous disposons, budgétaires et extra-budgétaires, pour y parvenir. Et là, la création d'un fonds stratégique européen d'investissement, je pense, est de nature à créer la confiance et à permettre un levier important, j'en suis conscient, mais en deux temps. D'abord, lever de l'argent sur les marchés, puis ensuite réduire le risque de certains investissements. Deuxièmement, il faut que ces financements aillent jusqu'à l'économie réelle. Il faut donc qu'on mette en place, pardonnez le franglais, un pipeline de projets, un tuyau, un mécanisme qui doit être lui-même appuyé par une assistante technique efficace. Et troisièmement, il faut améliorer l'environnement de l'investissement. Et là, c'est tout ce dont Jonathan Lille, j'imagine, vous a parlé, ou d'autres collègues auraient pu vous parler, c'est tout ce qui concerne le marché intérieur et les barrières qu'il faut encore lever pour que l'investissement soit facilité. La chair de notre plan d'investissement, c'est de faire un usage plus intelligent de l'argent dont nous disposons. Alors, vous connaissez le mécanisme. 5 milliards d'euros qui viennent de la Banque européenne d'investissement, 16 milliards d'euros qui sont des garanties prises sur le budget. Ça fait un fonds de 21 milliards d'euros. Et avec ça, le fonds doit permettre de lever, puis de procurer, à travers la Banque européenne d'investissement, des financements pour des projets qui ont un haut niveau de retour pour l'économie européenne, mais qui auraient été trop risqués pour des investisseurs privés s'il n'y avait pas cette partie de risque qui est au fond socialisée ou collectivement assumée. Et c'est ainsi qu'est conçu le plan. Mais le financement, c'est une partie importante, très importante, mais c'est seulement une partie de l'histoire. Et il fallait mettre en face, et il faut mettre en face des financements et des projets. Et on est obligé de constater qu'il y avait un manque de projets. Moi, je suis très satisfait de voir qu'affluent aujourd'hui sur la table de la Commission des projets nombreux. Je crois que l'Allemagne en a présenté 80 milliards, la France 50, l'Italie 40. Je reviendrai tout à l'heure là-dessus, peu importe ces chiffres, parce que ce n'est pas du tout comme ça que ça va se passer. Mais ça prouve en tout cas qu'il y a des projets. Et quand on voit arriver 1300 milliards d'euros de projets, ils ne sont pas tous bons, ils ne sont pas tous mûrs, mais c'est la coïncidence entre les ressources qu'on dégage et les projets qu'on mène qui fait l'importance du plan. Il faut aussi faire en sorte que ces projets deviennent de plus en plus profitables et même productifs. Alors, au fond, de quoi s'agit-il? On veut créer une sorte de hub dans le sein du groupe BEI pour tous ceux qui participent au processus d'investissement, les autorités publiques qui vont pouvoir utiliser des investissements innovants, les investisseurs potentiels et aussi ceux dans lesquels on investit potentiellement. Et j'ajoute aussi, il faudra y travailler, le réseau des banques publiques d'investissement dont la plupart des grands pays de la zone euro se sont maintenant dotés, dont d'autres envisagent de se doter. Je crois que même en Europe, il y a déjà une vingtaine de banques publiques d'investissement. Elles n'ont pas toutes la même taille, elles n'ont pas toutes la même force de frappe, mais elles existent et il faut structurer ce réseau. Alors, comme le disait Michel, ça n'épuise pas le sujet. C'est seulement un élément d'un carré. J'ai parlé de la Banque centrale européenne et de la politique monétaire, juste pour dire que je pense qu'elle est intelligente, mais qu'elle n'est pas arrivée au bout. Mais forcément, on respecte toujours l'indépendance de la Banque centrale. Il faut aussi des réformes structurelles. J'ai rencontré aujourd'hui les autorités italiennes dans le cadre de la discussion qu'on a sur nos échéances budgétaires. Il faut la consolidation budgétaire, cher Michel, mais non pas conçue comme une fin en soi, mais comme un élément qui permet justement d'avoir des réformes structurelles plus efficaces. Et enfin, il faut cet investissement. Et la Commission a pour rôle dans tout ça d'aider les États membres, d'être à leur côté, de mener un dialogue constructif avec eux pour faire en sorte que ce plan fonctionne et s'insère dans cet ensemble. Before I conclude, let me share what I view as the main risk to success. And these are the following. First, we have to be conscious that the issue of timing is key, both for macroeconomic and for political reasons. We need results, you're perfectly right, not in 2017. Of course, the global result is in 2017. But since 2015, we cannot afford to wait until 2017 to see the first signs of success on the ground. I know that expectations are high, and we must beware a possible kickback if no concrete signs can be seen soon. And this is why we accelerated the conception of the project. We must now accelerate to the implementation of the plan. We have also to be very cautious and avoid two dangers in terms of governance and selection of the project. The first danger is risk aversion, which would lead to invest in the places and projects which would have taken place anyway. That's not the purpose of the plan. The investment plan for Europe is a new tool for a new purpose, taking more risk to invest in the future of our economies at a point where obviously this does not seem to be an obvious call. We should make no mistake, no risk means no return. That's a very important principle to me. And the second risk is, sorry to say that, the temptation which exists among all policymakers of a kind of juste retour, I want my money back, where each member state expects to quickly get back what it paid in or the same percentage of investment that it represents in the GDP of Europe. I can understand that. I've been so long in politics myself. But not only it is the contrary of the European spirit, but I think it would be very short-sighted at the current juncture, as it would ignore how interdependent our economies have become. So what must be the criteria of the plan? It's not the fact that the project is Italian or German or French. It's the fact that the project is good. And if it's good, it will meet financing. And that's the way we should conceive the plan and lead the governments of the plan. Governance by project. That's the way we do, for example, in France, the country I know best, as we say in the Commission, with the strategic investments or with the plan for future investments. The economy of the continent faces the risk of a long period of disappointingly low growth if we fail to succeed in closing this investment gap. We collectively, I think, made huge progress in the last months in recognizing the risk and putting in place a clear and, let's say it, flexible framework to take on this challenge, because I know that the pact is sometimes accused of being stubborn or rigid. It's not exactly the case. We can do better, and we'll work on that, especially for investment. But still, it offers, I think, some margin. Policymakers, market participants, and entrepreneurs, everywhere on the continent, should now work together to make the best use of the tools. Constant discussions between stakeholders will be key in the times to come. And so my last word is very simple. Let's go to work and let's make this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Moscovici, in your English-French-English speech. With these three impressive speeches given by Minister Padoan, Minister Sapin, and Commissioner Moscovici, we conclude the first day of this seminar. Thank you very much for your contribution and participation. Good night.